In wealthy nations, rapid structural and economic expansion is currently masking a severe internal collapse. Between 1988 and 2008, in the United States, the use of clinical antidepressants rose 400%. In a similar timeframe, suicide rates among the young tripled. Economic prosperity does not insulate a population from psychological despair. Charting GDP against suicide rates across 132 countries reveals higher suicide in wealthier nations. Transient happiness fails to explain this. Poorer nations like Niger and Togo had the lowest suicide rates, insulated by an extraordinarily high rate of perceived meaning in life. Abstracting meaning from the world is the core function of a healthy psychological framework. It is the mechanism that allows a mind to process adversity without breaking. The data suggests that optimizing for material wealth while neglecting a meaning-making framework correlates with a high risk of widespread psychological distress. Navigating chaotic life events absolutely requires an internal psychological compass. Leading clinical researchers, such as Dr. Robert Emmons, classify this capability as spiritual intelligence. It is a distinct, measurable human intelligence, defined by the capacity to process reality and extract profound significance from daily events. Historically, the Islamic tradition developed a highly structured framework for building this intelligence, known as Tazkiyyah an-nafs, or the purification of the soul. In the modern era, Islamic prayer is frequently dismissed as rote ritual or abstract dogma, but classical scholars approached it as a sophisticated psychological therapy meant to actively treat diseases of the mind and heart. By clinically deconstructing a specific prayer, a dua prescribed by Prophet Muhammad for anxiety and grief, we can observe cognitive mechanisms that perfectly parallel modern cognitive behavioral therapy. Within this clinical framework, Tazkiyyah is positioned as a rigorous psychological discipline aimed at fostering long-term emotional stability. To understand the theology, we have to look at the biology. Islamic prayer requires a state of khushu, a deep, deliberate spiritual focus. This focus is the necessary condition for the physical postures of prayer to affect brain chemistry. In 2006, neuroscientists proposed the transient hyperfrontality hypothesis. The prefrontal cortex regulates attention and emotion. When it becomes hyperactive, it drives the hypervigilance and hyperawareness that define clinical anxiety. This is a radionuclide brain imaging scan measuring regional cerebral blood flow, providing empirical proof of how intense Islamic prayer alters neural activity. Performed automatically without khushu, the scan shows minimal alterations, remaining comparable to standard daily tasks. With deep spiritual concentration, blood flow in the frontal lobes decreases, achieving transient hypofrontality. The ego's drive to control the environment is suspended. Simultaneously, blood flow increases in the basal ganglia, a region implicated in the brain's reward system. The theological concept of absolute submission corresponds directly to a neurophysiologically measurable state. Surrender provides immediate clinical relief. We can trace how this state is achieved by examining the exact text of the anti-anxiety dua. The first quadrant addresses identity. Humans are embedded in complex social networks. We utilize self-monitoring to constantly shift our personalities, acting differently around colleagues than we do around family. Anxiety frequently triggers when an individual experiences role confusion, facing a crisis where none of their constructed social identities know how to react to solve the problem. The opening phrase, "I am your slave," is not self-deprecation. It's a clinical intervention establishing an immutable baseline identity that supersedes all social roles. Anchoring one's core identity in servitude to the divine prevents psychological slavery to transient metrics. When physical appearance fades or wealth disappears, the core identity remains intact. Sufi scholars refer to the active maintenance of this awareness as muraqabah. This baseline identity provides a consistent reference point when shifting social roles create a sense of internal fragmentation. The second quadrant of this prayer addresses the concept of human agency. A misplaced internal locus of control over uncontrollable events traps the mind in a paralyzing loop of "why me?" and "what did I do to deserve this?" "My forehead is in your hand" acts as a calculated, deliberate surrender of human agency to halt that destructive cognitive loop. By accepting qadar, or divine destiny, the individual acknowledges that the decree is inherently wise. This forces the brain to pivot from panicking over what was lost to actively asking, what can I learn from this? This meaning-making process aligns with psychotherapies from extreme trauma survivors. Viktor Frankl observed that enduring severe adversity requires abstracting objective meaning from the suffering itself. In Islamic psychology, this strength of self-regulation is called sabr. It is the willpower that enables a person to act beneficially, even when entirely stripped of environmental control. Step 2 neutralizes the illusion of control, replacing paralyzing anxiety with regulated action. The third quadrant pivots to the invocation of the divine names. Psychologists define the emotion of awe as a two-step cognitive process, experiencing vastness followed by mental accommodation. Invoking God's infinite attributes, the eternally forgiving, the provider, the most merciful, creates an experience of vastness designed to shatter the patient's limited mental structures. Faced with this vastness, the mind accommodates. It expands its cognitive framework, forging new mental pathways capable of processing hope and mapping solutions. The final quadrant petitions for the Quran to be the light of the chest and the reliever of distress. Applying tajweed, the strict phonetic rules and rhythmic focus of Quranic recitation, serves an active neurological function. The cadence and precision stabilize the autonomic nervous system, locking in this newly accommodated mental state. Steps 3 and 4 utilize the psychology of awe to break negative loops, and rhythmic recitation to hardwire the positive outcome. This comparative flowchart maps the structural overlap between modern clinical therapy and classical theology. On the left, the standard cognitive behavioral therapy loop operates by identifying emotional triggers, challenging unhelpful thoughts, and reframing core beliefs. On the right, the Tazkiyyah cycle executes the exact same process. It builds core self-awareness, forces the surrender of false control, induces cognitive awe, and regulates the nervous system. The classical religious text executes the exact cognitive mechanisms of modern psychotherapy. This specific prayer functions as an active cognitive intervention, utilizing the same mechanisms found in modern therapeutic practice. Building a truly resilient human psyche requires deliberate structural architecture, constructed carefully from the foundational principles from up. Modern educational and biopsychosocial models attempt to build this resilience while entirely ignoring the spiritual dimension. The data shows this approach is failing. To effectively treat the modern crisis of anxiety and despair, clinical practice must evolve. The medical model must expand into a biopsychosocial spiritual framework. Medicating biology and managing behavioral symptoms are often insufficient for addressing an existential crisis. Human flourishing requires architecting a soul capable of extracting divine meaning from worldly chaos.